One day, the king of Armenia, curious by nature and looking for a little diversion, sent out his messengers into the land, announcing that he would hand over an apple made of gold to the person who would tell him the ultimate of lies. People came from far and near. There was no shortage of liars in the country, and each told their story to the king. But a ruler is used to hearing all kinds of stories, and no one could convince the king that he was the ultimate liar. Finally, the king began to tire of the whole game, and he wondered if he should call it off. Then a poor man in tattered clothes appeared before the king with an earthen jar under his arm. The king asked what he could do for the man. The man wanted to know if the king had forgotten that he was to fill up this jar with gold because he owed him a jar full of gold. The man is a liar, the king explained. He doesn't owe him a speck of gold. In that case, he's the ultimate liar, the man insisted, and the king had to hand over the golden apple. The king started to realize that he'd been outwitted, but he wouldn't give in that easily. You are not the ultimate liar, he told the man. Then would the king please just fill up the jar, if he doesn't mind? In the end, the king had no choice but to hand over the golden apple to the man. Why is it so delightful to our brains to hear stories like the one about the golden apple I just told you? That's exactly what this video is all about. I want to encourage you to use more storytelling in your business writing, in your business messaging, generally speaking. But I also wanted to give you in this video a step-by-step guide how to use stories, an easy, simple way to start using more stories in your business. When we hear stories, our brain activates complex neural processes. Several biochemicals play a role in this, but there are three important ones I want to talk about today. And they are dopamine, oxytocin, and cortisol. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's associated with reward and pleasure. When we hear a story that engages us intellectually or emotionally, our brain releases dopamine, which reinforces our attention and our interest. This creates a sense of pleasure and satisfaction, which motivates us to continue listening to the story. Let's now look at the second biochemical your brain uses in the story cocktail, oxytocin. It's often called the love hormone because it has to do with social bonding and trust. Studies show that when we hear stories that has a high emotional or social content, our brain releases this oxytocin, and that helps us to identify more with the character or the events. And then there's cortisol, which is often associated with stress. When we hear a story that has a lot of conflict or uncertainty in it, our brains may release cortisol. But this creates a heightened sense of arousal and tension, which makes the story more engaging and memorable to us. Now, because of these powerful biochemicals that can make your audience engage with your content better, it's worth your while to learn to tell stories better in your business. That's the one takeaway I want you to have from this video. The other one is you have to learn, when does your brain recognize a narrative as a story and that's just not mere fact sharing. And that's the other part this video is about. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, like it, and share it with your friends if you think the content is valuable. Often when you ask people as a solopreneur, where can I learn more about how to write stories well in my business? They will refer you to Joseph Campbell. He wrote this amazing book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces. And it's really good, but it's very esoteric, out there, otherworldly. As a solopreneur, I found it hard to start applying Joseph Campbell's principles in my business writing. Is there a Cliff Notes version somewhere? I wondered. And then I found it. It's a book called Sell with a Story by Paul Smith. And I started using his framework in my own writing. And I know it was working because I use it on my About page to tell my origin story. And often in podcast interviews, when I'm a guest on podcast interviews, people would refer to my origin story that they read on my website at my About page. And I knew, aha, I'm onto something good. It is working. And today I want to share with you that framework of Smith's, a simple framework that you can start applying today in your business. But since we already know how compelling stories can be, let's use a real story to get to know Smith's framework better. Here goes. One day, a pigeon saw an ant fall into a stream. It looked as if the ant was drowning. Concerned, the bird flew nearer and held a blade of grass for the ant in the water. The ant climbed out, immediately bit the pigeon on his leg, and the pigeon flew away. Are you thinking, what a stupid story? The reason why you find this story so very unsatisfying is because when I started telling you about the good deed of the pigeon, your brain released some oxytocin, or that bonding hormone in your brain. But then the good deed, the story didn't close the loop of the good deed. It wasn't rewarded with another good deed. There was uncertainty in it. So your brain also released some cortisol into your system. And that's why you don't like the story. But that's not where the story really ends. I'm torturing you on purpose, but it's for a good cause. I am concealing the actual ending from you because I want to make an important point about it later on in this video. And I want your brain to be on the lookout for it. Now that we have a simple story to work with, let's return to Mr. Paul Smith's framework and see, when is a story actually a story? When is a narrative? When does it become a story? Paul Smith talks about 6 elements that has to be included into any story. But then in his book, he teased out those 6 elements a little bit later, structured it slightly differently, and he added bookend questions at the beginning, at the end, 1 at the beginning, 2 at the end. So all in all, there are 9 simple questions in the Paul Smith framework that you need to ask yourself to determine, is this thing I'm telling, is it actually a story? Before we get to the 9 questions, let's quickly look at the 6 basic elements a narrative has to have for your brain to recognize it as a story, to start paying attention and get those jars of biochemicals out that will make you pay even more attention. For a story to be a story, it has to happen at a specific time, in a particular place. There must be a main character. There must be an antagonist or an obstacle. The main character must want something. They must have a goal, and in the last place there must be events. Let's now return to the yet unfinished story of the pigeon and the ant. One day a pigeon saw an ant fall into a stream. Okay, one day, that ticks off the box, specific time. Into a stream is at a particular place. The main character is the pigeon, and the antagonist is the ant. So that's the first 4 covered. The goal of the pigeon is to save the ant. And are the events? Events is the and then part of the story. And there are clearly events in the story. First, the pigeon saw the ant. Then he flew closer. Then he held out the blade of grass. Then the ant climbed out. Then he bit the pigeon. Then the pigeon flew away. So that's what we mean by events. And this is indeed a story because it ticks all 6 our boxes. Let me quickly just interrupt myself and add something that Smith is saying that's actually very important. And it has to do with the obstacle or the antagonist, the conflict in the story. Smith observes that we often underplay the obstacles. We often underplay our struggles, especially in business stories, and that is a mistake. The conflict is an important part of the story. Remember that cortisol part that makes the story more memorable and engaging? You want to include that as well. So to remind yourself of this, the sentence, "The cat sat on the mat," is just a sentence. But The cat sat on the other cat's mat is the beginning of a real story. Remember to add the struggles and the conflict to your story. Yes, the story of the pigeon and the ant is indeed a true story, but like we said before, it feels very unsatisfactory. Let's think about why. I borrowed this story from Aesop. He wrote hundreds of these fables. And the one thing Aesop always did, he included the moral lesson of his fable. That is an important lesson we can all learn from Aesop's example. With the story ending where it is, the moral lesson could be something like, don't expect gratitude when you help other people. Okay, that's a possibility, but I warned you before, the story ends at a different place. The story ends with this sentence. The pigeon never saw the boy with the bow and arrow, but the ant did. Aha! So actually the ant did return the favor and he saved the bird's life in return. Unexpected twists like this delight the human brain. It squirts more dopamine into your system. And because the story now closes the loop where one good deed leads to another good deed, it's like a natural kind of justice system we all adhere to, you also got a nice dose of oxytocin in the bargain. Whenever you can, use surprises and twists in your story. Let's now return to the 9 simple questions Smith wants you to ask to make sure your narrative is indeed a story. I'm going to read all 9 of them for you. It's a bit of a repetition, but I really want this to sink in. And let me read it to you so that I get it completely right. Number 1, why should I listen to this story? Number 2, when does the story take place? Number 3, where does the story take place? Number 4, who is the hero and what do they want? Number 5, what's the opportunity or the problem they ran into? Number 6, what did they do about it? Number 7, how did it turn out in the end? Number 8, what did you learn from it? Now, good old Aesop, right? There we are. And number 9, what do you think I should do? Let's answer Smith's last 3 questions when we think about our story of the pigeon and the ant. How did it end? Well, different than you expected, and that's why it delighted your brain so much. What do you want me to learn from it? Well, sometimes it seems as if people are hurting you when they are actually helping you. What do you want me to do? I guess that's simple too. Don't automatically assume bad intent. Now let's see if we can answer the first question. Why should I listen to this story? Now in his book, Smith advises that we act like Aesop and we tell people upfront why we are telling them the story. What's the moral lesson they can expect to learn from it? You are not to mimic Pulitzer Prize winning novelists and be subtle and sophisticated about your intentions. In business writing, be very upfront and straightforward about it. Be on the nose. Tell people exactly why they should listen to this story. Now, for instance, if I were to use the story of the pigeon and the ant as a demonstration of reciprocity in business, I would preface the story with something like, this reminds me of the age-old tale which demonstrates reciprocity very clearly. That's it, on the nose, straight out, up front. Just tell it as it is. That's an important difference between literary writing and business writing. Remember, I'm just sharing Smith's basic structure in this video. He has a ton of more wonderful, valuable tips. So I want to encourage you, read the whole book if you really want to master storytelling well. Let's analyze another story using Smith's framework. This one is one of my favorites. It comes from the book Essentialism by Greg McKeown, and it tells the story of a little girl called Cynthia. In this story, you will get a great cocktail of oxytocin, dopamine, and cortisol. Let's listen to it first, and then I'll unpack it later. Cynthia, then 12, and her dad planned this date night in San Francisco, and they planned it for months ahead. Her dad was to give a presentation in the city, and she would attend the last hour of his presentation. Afterwards, she would meet him at the back of the room, and the two of them would slip away before anyone could talk to him. They'd then catch a trolley to Chinatown, have their favorite food, look at the sights, buy souvenirs, then catch a taxi back to the hotel room, jump into the hotel pool, order hot fudge sundaes from room service, and watch a late night show together. Cue. At this point, tons of floods and streams of oxytocin and dopamine should be flowing through your system. Everything went according to plan, but when they left the convention center, her father ran into an old friend and business associate. He then invited them to a magnificent seafood dinner at the wharf. Cynthia's heart fell. She hated seafood. Right. Cue the cortisol at this point. How great it is to see you, and dinner at the wharf sounds wonderful, her dad replied. And Cynthia could just imagine how bored she was going to be the whole night. And what about all the treats and the things she and her dad had planned? Still, some cortisol squirting into your system. But then her father said, but not tonight. Tonight, Cynthia and I have a special date night planned. And then he grabbed her hand, and they had the most unforgettable night in San Francisco. Okay, at this point, once again, tons of dopamine and tons of oxytocin. The details that McEwen adds to this story is just delicious, isn't it? And in his book, in Paul Smith's book, he teaches you to do that really well. So I want to reiterate, read the whole thing if you want to get good at this. Now let's see if the 6 elements that Paul Smith is talking about, are they in the story? When did this happen? When Cynthia was 12. Where did it happen? In San Francisco. Who is the main character? Cynthia. Who is the antagonist? Her dad's friend. What is her goal? To have a date night with her dad. And in the last place, are there some events? Yes, we can clearly see then this happened, and this, then this. There's a chronological kind of events happening. So yes, this is a story, but you knew that already. Let's now turn to the bookend questions. Why should you listen to the story? I gave you that reason at the beginning when I started telling the story, because I wanted to use the story to talk about the 9 questions again. And I also promised you that this particular story will give you a great mix of our 3 biochemicals, oxytocin, dopamine, and cortisol. And it did, didn't it? How about questions 8 and 9? What did you learn from it? What do you think I should do? Now, just like the story of the pigeon and the ant, this story also has a delightful little surprise ending. Who was Cynthia's dad? It was none other than the famous Stephen R. Covey, the writer of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He famously said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. That simple fact, the fact that it was Stephen Covey, changes the whole story. It elevates it to something a lot more memorable. And Cynthia told this story to Greg McEwen just a couple of weeks after her dad had died. And she remembered this incident with so much fondness and love, and recalled how it bonded her to her dad, and that she realized how important she was for him. But to answer the question, what did you learn from this story, from essentialism, from the book's point of view? It would be to put first things first, and that you should follow Stephen Covey's example, who actually practiced what he preached. And question 9, what does Greg McEwen want you to do using this story? He wants you to put first things first, like your family, for instance. But I retold you this story with a different goal in mind. So what do I want you to learn from this story? Stories impact our brains in a different way than mere facts. They can reach our hearts, and they can change our minds. And now to question 9, what do I think you should do? I think you should use Smith's simple framework with the 9 questions a lot more in your business storytelling. Remember to subscribe, remember to hit the like button and share this video if you think it's valuable.